Hey guys, tonight we're embarking on an epic journey through 1,000 years of medieval Europe. From the ashes of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, we're going to witness the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth of nations, and the incredible resilience of ordinary people who built our modern world, stone by stone, prayer by prayer, one muddy footstep at a time. This isn't just a history lesson. It's the story of survival, adaptation, and the slow, painful birth of civilization from chaos. We'll walk through plague-ravaged cities, stand in the shadows of towering cathedrals, and witness the daily struggles of peasants, knights, merchants, and kings who shaped the world we live in today. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because what we're about to explore isn't just the past, it's the foundation of everything we know about government, religion, art, and human nature itself. Get comfortable. Seriously. Adjust those pillows. Pull up that blanket. Because we're going on quite a ride through 1,000 years of triumph, tragedy, and the unstoppable human spirit that refused to give up, even in the darkest of times. Picture this. It's the year 476 CE, and you're witnessing the end of the world as people knew it. The Western Roman Empire, that mighty colossus that had ruled most of Europe for over 400 years, is breathing its last breath. The last emperor, a boy with the ironically prophetic name Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, is being deposed by a Germanic warlord named Odoacer. But this isn't just a change of government. This is the collapse of civilization itself. For centuries, Rome had been the beating heart of European life. Roman roads connected distant provinces. Roman law governed millions of people. Roman legions kept the peace. And Roman culture provided a shared identity that stretched from Britain to the Black Sea. Roman aqueducts brought fresh water to cities. Roman baths provided hygiene and social gathering places, and Roman schools educated the children of the elite. Now all of that was crumbling. The roads, once marvels of engineering that allowed armies and merchants to travel swiftly across the continent, were falling into disrepair. Without central authority to maintain them, bridges collapsed, surfaces cracked, and weeds grew through the carefully laid stones. What had once been highways became dangerous paths haunted by bandits and wild animals. The cities, once bustling centers of commerce and culture, were emptying. Rome itself, which had housed over 1 million people at its height, shrank to perhaps 20,000 souls huddled among the ruins of their former glory. The great public buildings, the forums, the theaters, the baths, stood empty and crumbling, their marble facades slowly being stripped away by desperate people who needed building materials for their humble homes. The economy, based on long-distance trade and specialized production, collapsed almost overnight. Without the security provided by Roman legions, merchants couldn't safely transport goods across long distances. Local communities had to become self-sufficient or perish. The sophisticated monetary system gave way to barter and subsistence farming. But perhaps most devastating of all was the loss of knowledge and literacy. The Roman educational system, which had produced generations of literate administrators, lawyers, and scholars, disappeared along with the empire. Books were lost, libraries abandoned, and the ability to read and write became increasingly rare outside of monasteries. Into this vacuum stepped various Germanic tribes: the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, and others. These weren't necessarily the savage barbarians that Roman propaganda had portrayed them as. Many had lived alongside Romans for generations, serving in Roman armies and adopting Roman customs. But they brought with them different traditions, different laws, and different ways of organizing society. The result was chaos. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of chaos with armies clashing and cities burning, though there was some of that, but the slow, grinding chaos of systems breaking down. Local strongmen carved out territories for themselves. Communities that had relied on imperial protection found themselves defenseless against raiders and bandits. Trade networks that had operated for centuries simply stopped functioning. Imagine waking up one morning to find that all the institutions you'd taken for granted, the police, the postal service, the courts, the schools, the hospitals, had simply vanished. That's what happened to millions of people across Europe in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. But here's the remarkable thing. People adapted. They always do. In the absence of imperial authority, new forms of organization emerged. Local bishops, who had maintained their positions through the empire's decline, often became the de facto rulers of their cities. They organized defense, distributed food to the hungry, and maintained what little remained of Roman law and administration. Germanic kings, rather than simply destroying Roman institutions, often tried to preserve and adapt them. They issued laws that blended Germanic customs with Roman legal traditions. They appointed Roman administrators to help them govern their new territories. They even sometimes claimed to rule in the name of the distant Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople. The Catholic Church, which had become the empire's official religion only a century earlier, suddenly found itself the sole surviving institution with anything approaching universal authority. Monasteries became centers of learning and preservation, where monks painstakingly copied ancient texts and maintained the flickering flame of literacy. This wasn't the Dark Ages in the sense of universal ignorance and barbarism. It was a time of transformation, of old systems dying and new ones struggling to be born. The Europe that would emerge from this chaos would be very different from the Roman world that had preceded it, but it would also carry forward many Roman traditions and innovations. The collapse of Rome wasn't just an ending, it was also a beginning. The medieval world was about to be born from the ashes of the ancient one, and it would prove to be every bit as complex, sophisticated, and fascinating as what had come before. In the ruins of Roman villas, Germanic chieftains were learning to read Latin. In abandoned Roman cities, Christian bishops were establishing new forms of government. In the countryside, Roman farmers and Germanic settlers were learning to live and work together, creating new communities that would become the villages and towns of medieval Europe. The world was ending, but it was also beginning. And the people who lived through this transformation, the last Romans and the first Europeans, were about to embark on one of the most remarkable journeys in human history. From the chaos of Rome's collapse, something extraordinary began to emerge. Not immediately and not without tremendous struggle, but gradually, new kingdoms began to take shape across Europe. These weren't just random collections of warriors and farmers. They were the seeds of the nations we know today. The most successful of these early kingdoms was that of the Franks, a Germanic people who had settled in what is now France and Western Germany. Under their king Clovis, who ruled from 481 to 511 CE, the Franks did something that would change European history forever. They converted to Catholic Christianity. This wasn't just a personal religious decision. It was a masterstroke of political genius. While other Germanic kingdoms had adopted Arian Christianity, which the Roman population considered heretical, Clovis chose the same form of Christianity that his Roman subjects practiced. This meant that when Frankish warriors conquered Roman territories, they weren't seen as foreign heretics, but as fellow Christians. The conversion happened dramatically. According to legend, Clovis was losing a crucial battle when he prayed to his wife's Christian god, promising to convert if he won. The tide of battle turned. Clovis was victorious, and he was baptized along with 3,000 of his warriors in a single ceremony. Whether or not this story is literally true, it captures something important about how Christianity spread among the Germanic peoples, not just as a religion, but as a tool of political unity and legitimacy. But building a kingdom required more than just religious conversion. It required new forms of organization, new ways of binding people together in loyalty and mutual obligation. This is where we see the early development of what historians call feudalism, though the people living through it wouldn't have recognized that term. The basic idea was simple but revolutionary: land in exchange for service. A king would grant large estates to his most important followers who became his vassals. These vassals would then grant portions of their land to their own followers, and so on down the chain. At each level, the person receiving land owed military service, loyalty, and various other obligations to the person who granted it. This system solved several problems at once. It provided the king with a way to reward his followers without having to pay them in cash, which was scarce. It created a network of personal relationships that bound the kingdom together, and it ensured that there would always be trained warriors available when the kingdom was threatened. But it also created new problems. As power became more decentralized, local lords became increasingly independent. They built their own castles, maintained their own armies, and sometimes acted more like independent rulers than loyal vassals. The tension between central authority and local autonomy would be a defining feature of medieval politics for centuries to come. Meanwhile, other kingdoms were developing their own solutions to the challenges of post-Roman Europe. In England, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria were establishing themselves, each with their own kings, laws, and customs. These kingdoms were constantly at war with each other, but they were also developing sophisticated systems of government and law. The Anglo-Saxon legal system, for example, was based on the idea of compensation rather than punishment. If you killed someone, you didn't necessarily face execution. Instead, you paid vergild, or blood money, to the victim's family. The amount varied depending on the social status of the victim. A nobleman's life was worth more than a peasant's, which seems harsh to us, but it was actually a step forward from the endless cycles of revenge that had characterized earlier periods. In Spain, the Visigothic kingdom was developing its own unique blend of Germanic and Roman traditions. The Visigoths had been one of the first Germanic peoples to establish a lasting kingdom on former Roman territory, and they had learned to govern a mixed population of Goths and Romans. Their legal code, the Liber Judiciorum, was one of the most sophisticated legal documents of the early medieval period. But perhaps the most important development of this period was happening in Italy, where the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great was attempting something unprecedented, ruling a Germanic kingdom according to Roman principles. Theodoric, who ruled from 493 to 526 CE, maintained Roman law for his Roman subjects while allowing his Gothic followers to live according to their own customs. He preserved Roman institutions, patronized Roman scholars, and even maintained the Roman Senate. Theodoric's experiment was ultimately unsuccessful. His kingdom was conquered by the Byzantine Empire in the mid-6th century. But it showed that the Germanic kingdoms weren't simply replacing Roman civilization with something cruder and more primitive. They were trying to create something new that combined the best of both worlds. The church played a crucial role in all of these developments. Bishops weren't just religious leaders. They were often the most educated and capable administrators in their communities. They served as advisors to kings, judges in legal disputes, and organizers of public works. Monasteries became centers of learning and economic activity, preserving not just religious texts, but also classical literature, scientific knowledge, and practical skills. The monastery of Monte Cassino, founded by Saint Benedict around 529 CE, became the model for monastic communities throughout Europe. Benedict's rule, which governed the daily life of his monks, emphasized prayer, work, and study in equal measure. Ora et labora, pray and work, became the motto of medieval monasticism. These monastic communities weren't just retreats from the world. They were active participants in the creation of medieval civilization. Monks cleared forests, drained swamps, and established new agricultural techniques. They copied manuscripts, taught reading and writing, and served as scribes and secretaries for illiterate nobles. They provided hospitality to travelers, care for the sick, and charity for the poor. By the end of the 6th century, the basic structure of medieval Europe was beginning to take shape. Germanic kingdoms had established themselves across the former Western Roman Empire. The Catholic Church had become a unifying force that transcended political boundaries. New forms of social organization were developing that would eventually become the feudal system. And a new culture was emerging that blended Germanic, Roman, and Christian elements. This wasn't the Europe of Charlemagne or the Crusades. That was still centuries in the future. But the foundations were being laid. The medieval world was being born, one kingdom, one monastery, one village at a time. Just when it seemed like Europe might fragment into countless tiny kingdoms and never recover the unity it had known under Rome, along came a man who would change everything. His name was Charles, but history knows him as Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And great he was, in every sense of the word. Charlemagne became king of the Franks in 768 CE, inheriting a kingdom that was already the most powerful in Western Europe. But he wasn't content to simply maintain what his predecessors had built. He had a vision of something grander, a new Roman Empire, Christian in character, but universal in scope. Over the course of his 46-year reign, Charlemagne conquered most of Western and Central Europe. He defeated the Lombards in Italy, subdued the Saxons in Germany, pushed the Muslims back across the Pyrenees in Spain, and established Frankish authority from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. By the time he was finished, his empire was larger than anything Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. But Charlemagne's greatest achievement wasn't military, it was cultural. He presided over what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning and culture that laid the foundation for all subsequent European intellectual development. The centerpiece of this Renaissance was Charlemagne's palace school at Aachen, which he established around 780 CE. This wasn't just a school for the children of nobles. It was a center of learning that attracted scholars from across Europe and beyond. The school's most famous teacher was Alcuin of York, an English monk who had been educated in the great cathedral school of York and who brought with him the learning of the Anglo-Saxon world. Under Alcuin's direction, the palace school became a place where classical Latin literature was studied and preserved, where new works of theology and philosophy were written, and where the art of writing itself was revolutionized. The scribes at Aachen developed a new form of handwriting called Carolingian minuscule, which was clearer and more legible than the various scripts that had been used in the early medieval period. This script became the standard throughout Charlemagne's empire and eventually evolved into the lowercase letters we use today. But the Carolingian Renaissance wasn't limited to the palace school. Charlemagne issued a series of decrees requiring every monastery and cathedral in his empire to maintain a school and a library. He ordered that classical texts be copied and preserved, that new books be written, and that education be made available to a broader segment of the population. The results were remarkable. Monasteries that had been primarily concerned with prayer and manual labor suddenly became centers of intellectual activity. Monks who had spent their days copying religious texts now found themselves preserving the works of Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero. Schools that had taught only basic literacy now offered instruction in grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the 7 liberal arts that would form the basis of medieval education. This educational revival had profound consequences. For the first time since the fall of Rome, Europe had a significant number of literate, educated people. These people didn't just preserve the learning of the past, they built upon it, creating new works of theology, philosophy, history, and literature. One of the most important figures of this period was Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, and one of the first medieval historians to write in a truly classical style. His Life of Charlemagne is not only our best source for understanding the great emperor, but also a masterpiece of medieval literature that rivals the best works of ancient Rome. Another key figure was Rabanus Maurus, known as the Teacher of Germany, who established schools throughout the Frankish Empire and wrote encyclopedic works that preserved and transmitted classical knowledge to future generations. His students went on to become teachers themselves, spreading learning throughout Europe. The Carolingian Renaissance also saw remarkable developments in art and architecture. Charlemagne's palace chapel at Aachen, completed around 800 CE, was a masterpiece of early medieval architecture that combined Roman, Byzantine, and Germanic elements. Its soaring dome and intricate mosaics announced to the world that the Franks were the heirs of Rome and Byzantium. Manuscript illumination reached new heights during this period. The famous Coronation Gospels, probably created for Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800 CE, features some of the most beautiful and sophisticated artwork of the entire medieval period. The figures are painted with a naturalism and grace that wouldn't be seen again in European art for centuries. But perhaps the most significant achievement of the Carolingian Renaissance was the preservation of classical literature. Without the copying efforts undertaken in Charlemagne's scriptoriums, we would have lost most of the Latin literature that survives today. Works by Tacitus, Livy, Suetonius, and countless other Roman authors exist today only because Carolingian monks painstakingly copied them by hand. The Renaissance wasn't limited to high culture. Charlemagne also reformed the legal system, standardizing laws across his empire and ensuring that justice was administered more fairly. He established a system of royal inspectors called missi dominici, literally, those sent by the Lord, who traveled throughout the empire checking on local administrators and ensuring that royal decrees were being followed. He reformed the currency, establishing a new silver-based monetary system that brought stability to trade and commerce. He standardized weights and measures, making it easier for merchants to conduct business across long distances. He even attempted to reform the calendar, though this effort was less successful. Perhaps most importantly, Charlemagne created a new model of Christian kingship. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Romans in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This ceremony, which may have surprised Charlemagne himself, established the principle that the highest secular authority in Western Europe derived its legitimacy from the Church. The coronation created what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire, though it was neither holy nor Roman nor really an empire in the classical sense. But it did establish the idea that Europe could be united under a single Christian ruler, an idea that would inspire and torment European politics for the next 1,000 years. Charlemagne's empire didn't survive his death in 814. His son Louis the Pious lacked his father's strength and vision, and the empire was divided among Louis's 3 sons in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. This division created the basic outline of modern France, Germany, and Italy, but it also ended the dream of a unified Christian Europe. However, the cultural achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance proved more durable than the political unity of Charlemagne's empire. The schools he established continued to operate, the books his scribes copied continued to be read, and the intellectual traditions he fostered continued to develop. The Carolingian Renaissance proved that the Dark Ages were not so dark after all. It showed that medieval Europe was capable of great cultural achievements, that learning and literacy could flourish even in an age of political instability, and that the classical tradition could be preserved and transmitted to future generations. Most importantly, it established the pattern that would characterize medieval European civilization for the next several centuries. A combination of Germanic political traditions, Roman legal and administrative practices, and Christian religious and moral values. This synthesis, first achieved under Charlemagne, would prove to be one of the most creative and enduring cultural achievements in human history. The palace school at Aachen may have closed, the great emperor may have died, and his empire may have fragmented, but the Renaissance he initiated continued to bear fruit. The students of Alcuin became teachers themselves, spreading Carolingian learning throughout Europe. The books copied in Carolingian scriptoriums became the foundation of medieval libraries. The artistic and architectural innovations of the Carolingian period influenced European culture for centuries to come. In the end, Charlemagne's greatest conquest was not any territory or kingdom, but ignorance itself. He had shown that Europe could be more than a collection of warring tribes and petty kingdoms. It could be a civilization worthy of Rome and Athens, a Christian empire that combined the best of the ancient world with the new possibilities of the medieval age. Just as Europe was beginning to recover from the chaos following Rome's fall, just as Charlemagne's Renaissance was spreading learning and stability across the continent, a new terror appeared on the horizon. From the fjords and forests of Scandinavia came the Vikings, raiders, traders, and explorers who would reshape the medieval world in ways no one could have imagined. The first recorded Viking raid occurred in 793 CE, when Norse warriors attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of northern England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with horror. In this year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and sorely frightened the people. They consisted of immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. The attack on Lindisfarne was shocking not just because of its violence, but because of its target. Monasteries were supposed to be sacred spaces, protected by God and respected even by the most brutal warriors. The fact that these northern pagans would dare to attack such a holy place and slaughter its defenseless monks sent shockwaves throughout Christian Europe. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 2 centuries, Viking raids would terrorize the coasts and rivers of Europe from Ireland to Constantinople. Their distinctive longships, with their shallow drafts and flexible construction, could navigate both open seas and inland rivers, allowing them to strike deep into the heart of European kingdoms. The Vikings weren't just mindless barbarians, though Christian chroniclers often portrayed them that way. They were skilled sailors, accomplished craftsmen, and shrewd traders. Their society was complex and sophisticated, with its own laws, literature, and artistic traditions. They were also remarkably adaptable, able to function as raiders, traders, settlers, or mercenaries depending on the circumstances. What made the Vikings so terrifying to their contemporaries was their mobility and unpredictability. A Viking fleet could appear without warning, strike swiftly at an undefended target, and disappear before any organized resistance could be mounted. They perfected the art of the lightning raid, hitting monasteries, towns, and trading centers when they were least expected. The monastery of Saint Philibert on the island of Noirmoutier, for example, was raided so frequently that the monks eventually abandoned it altogether, carrying their saints' relics inland to safety. The great monastery of Saint Martin at Tours was attacked multiple times, despite being one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Europe. But the Vikings weren't content to simply raid and retreat. As the 9th century progressed, they began to establish permanent bases and even entire kingdoms in the lands they had conquered. In England, the great heathen army landed in 865 and proceeded to conquer most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Only the Kingdom of Wessex, under Alfred the Great, managed to resist the Viking onslaught. Alfred's struggle against the Vikings was one of the defining conflicts of the early medieval period. After suffering a series of defeats, Alfred was forced to retreat to the marshes of Somerset, where he regrouped and planned his counterattack. His eventual victory at the Battle of Edington in 878 saved Anglo-Saxon England from complete conquest and established him as one of the great heroes of English history. But even Alfred couldn't drive the Vikings out entirely. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum established the Danelaw, a large area of northern and eastern England where Viking law and customs prevailed. This division of England between Anglo-Saxon and Viking territories would have profound consequences for English culture and language. In France, the Vikings established themselves along the Seine River and repeatedly attacked Paris. The Siege of Paris in 885 to 886 was one of the most dramatic events of the period, with a small garrison of Franks holding out against a massive Viking army for months. The Vikings were eventually bought off with a huge payment of silver, but they returned again and again. Eventually, the French king Charles the Simple decided that if he couldn't beat the Vikings, he might as well join them. In 911, he granted the Viking leader Rollo a large territory in northern France in exchange for his promise to defend the realm against other Viking raiders. This territory became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen, and its rulers would go on to conquer England in 1066. The Vikings also established kingdoms in Ireland, founding cities like Dublin, Cork, and Waterford. They settled in Scotland, particularly in the Orkney and Shetland Islands, where they maintained their own culture and language for centuries. They even reached as far as Iceland, Greenland, and North America, establishing settlements that predated Columbus's voyage by 500 years. But perhaps the most remarkable Viking achievement was their penetration of Eastern Europe. Swedish Vikings, known as the Rus, traveled down the rivers of Russia and Ukraine, establishing trading posts and eventually entire kingdoms. The city of Kiev became the center of a powerful Viking state that controlled trade between Scandinavia and Byzantium. These Eastern Vikings were primarily traders rather than raiders, though they were certainly capable of violence when necessary. They carried furs, amber, and slaves south to Constantinople, returning with silk, spices, and silver. The wealth they accumulated from this trade is evident in the thousands of Arabic silver coins that have been found in Scandinavian archaeological sites. The Vikings also served as mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire, forming the famous Varangian Guard that protected the emperor himself. These Viking warriors were renowned for their loyalty and ferocity, and many of them carved runic inscriptions on the walls of Hagia Sophia that can still be seen today. The impact of the Viking Age on medieval Europe cannot be overstated. The Vikings forced European kingdoms to develop better defenses, more efficient armies, and stronger central governments. They stimulated trade and urban development, founding cities and establishing new trade routes. They spread Scandinavian culture and language throughout Northern Europe, influencing everything from law and government to art and literature. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings demonstrated that the medieval world was not isolated or static. They connected Europe to the wider world, bringing goods and ideas from as far away as Central Asia and North America. They showed that the seas were highways rather than barriers, and that determined people could travel vast distances and establish themselves in new lands. The Viking Age officially ended in 1066 when Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England. But by then, the Vikings had already transformed themselves and the world around them. Many had converted to Christianity and settled down as farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. Their descendants would become some of medieval Europe's most important rulers and cultural figures. The terror from the north had become part of the fabric of European civilization, leaving behind a legacy of exploration, trade, and cultural exchange that would influence the continent for centuries to come. As the Viking raids gradually subsided and Europe entered the 10th and 11th centuries, a new form of social organization was crystallizing across the continent. This system, which historians call feudalism, would define European society for the next several centuries and create the framework within which medieval civilization would flourish. Feudalism wasn't invented by any single person or decreed by any king. It evolved gradually from the practical needs of a society that lacked strong central government and faced constant threats from raiders, invaders, and local conflicts. At its heart was a simple but revolutionary idea. Personal relationships based on mutual obligation could provide the security and organization that formal institutions could not. The basic building block of feudal society was the relationship between lord and vassal. A vassal would kneel before his lord, place his hands between the lord's hands, and swear an oath of loyalty and service. In return, the lord would grant the vassal a fief, usually land, but sometimes an office or source of income, that would provide for the vassal's needs and enable him to fulfill his obligations. This ceremony, known as homage, created a sacred bond that was both personal and political. The vassal owed his lord military service, typically 40 days per year, as well as various other duties such as attending the lord's court, providing counsel, and contributing to certain expenses. The lord, in turn, owed his vassal protection, justice, and maintenance, ensuring that the vassal had the means to live according to his station. But feudalism was more than just a military system. It was a complete social order that governed every aspect of life. At the top of the pyramid was the king, who was theoretically the ultimate owner of all land in the kingdom. Below him were the great nobles, dukes, counts, and earls, who held vast territories directly from the king. These great lords in turn granted portions of their land to lesser nobles, who might grant portions to knights, and so on down the chain. At the bottom of this system were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. Most peasants were serfs, bound to the land they worked and subject to their lord's authority in almost every aspect of their lives. They could not leave the manor without permission, could not marry without consent, and owed their lord a portion of their crops as well as various services and payments. This might sound like a system of oppression, and in many ways it was. But it also provided security and stability in an age when both were desperately needed. The lord had a vested interest in protecting his peasants, since their labor was the source of his wealth. The peasants, in turn, had a guaranteed place to live and work, as well as protection from bandits and invaders. The manor, the basic economic unit of feudal society, was largely self-sufficient. It included not only the lord's residence and the peasant's village, but also fields, forests, mills, and workshops that provided for most of the community's needs. The Lord's Hall served as a courthouse, meeting place, and center of social life. The village church provided spiritual guidance and often served as a school and hospital as well. Life on a medieval manor followed the rhythm of the agricultural year. Spring was the time for plowing and planting, summer for tending crops and making hay, autumn for harvest and preparation for winter. The peasants worked the Lord's land as well as their own, using primitive tools and techniques that had changed little since Roman times. The three-field system, which became widespread during this period, was one of the few agricultural innovations of the early medieval period. Instead of leaving half their land fallow each year, as had been the Roman practice, medieval farmers divided their land into 3 fields, one planted with winter crops like wheat or rye, one with spring crops like oats or barley, and one left fallow to recover its fertility. This system increased agricultural productivity by about 50% and helped support the population growth that characterized the High Middle Ages. The feudal system also had important political implications. Because power was decentralized and based on personal relationships rather than formal institutions, medieval kingdoms were often weak and fragmented. Kings had to constantly negotiate with their vassals, who might have their own vassals and their own interests. A powerful duke or count might be more influential in his own territory than the king himself. This decentralization led to the rise of what historians call feudal monarchy, a form of government in which the king was first among equals rather than an absolute ruler. The king's power depended on his ability to maintain the loyalty of his vassals, who could withdraw their support if they felt he was not fulfilling his obligations to them. The most successful feudal monarchs were those who understood how to work within this system. William the Conqueror, who invaded England in 1066, was a master of feudal politics. After his victory at the Battle of Hastings, he systematically granted land to his Norman followers, while ensuring that no single vassal became too powerful. He also retained direct control of about 20% of English land, giving him a secure base of power. The feudal system also shaped medieval warfare. The heavily armored knight on horseback became the dominant figure on the medieval battlefield. These knights were not just warriors, but also landowners and local leaders, with a vested interest in maintaining the system that gave them their status and wealth. The code of chivalry that developed around knighthood was an attempt to civilize and Christianize what was essentially a warrior culture. Knights were expected to be brave in battle, loyal to their lords, and protective of the weak and innocent. They were also expected to be courteous, generous, and devout Christians. Of course, the reality often fell short of the ideal. Medieval knights could be brutal, greedy, and faithless. But the chivalric ideal provided a standard against which their behavior could be judged and helped to moderate some of the worst excesses of medieval warfare. The feudal system also had important cultural implications. The personal nature of feudal relationships fostered a culture of honor, loyalty, and personal bonds that would influence European literature, art, and social customs for centuries. The great epic poems of the medieval period, the Song of Roland, the Nibelungenlied, the Arthurian romances, all celebrate the feudal virtues of loyalty, courage, and honor. By the 11th century, feudalism had become the dominant form of social organization throughout most of Western Europe. It provided the framework within which medieval civilization would develop and flourish, creating the conditions for the great achievements of the High Middle Ages, the Crusades, the rise of towns and trade, the building of the great cathedrals, and the flowering of medieval culture. The feudal revolution had transformed Europe from a collection of weak kingdoms and tribal territories into a complex but stable social order that could support population growth, economic development, and cultural achievement. It was far from perfect, but it worked, providing the foundation upon which the medieval world would build its greatest accomplishments. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd of nobles, clergy, and common people in a field outside the French city of Clermont. What he said that day would launch one of the most extraordinary and controversial movements in medieval history, the Crusades. His call for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule would send hundreds of thousands of Europeans on a journey to the Holy Land, fundamentally altering the relationship between East and West, Christian and Muslim, and changing the course of European civilization forever. Urban's speech, as recorded by chroniclers, was a masterpiece of religious rhetoric and political manipulation. He spoke of the suffering of Eastern Christians under Muslim rule, of the desecration of holy sites, and of the duty of Western Christians to come to their aid. "God wills it," the crowd reportedly shouted in response, and within months, armies were forming across Europe for the journey to Jerusalem. But the First Crusade, which began in 1096, was unlike anything Europe had seen before. This wasn't just a military campaign. It was a mass movement that involved people from every level of society. Nobles sold their lands to finance the expedition, peasants abandoned their fields to follow charismatic preachers, and entire families set out for the Holy Land with little more than faith and determination. The journey itself was an ordeal that claimed thousands of lives before the Crusaders even reached their destination. The route led through the Byzantine Empire, across the hostile terrain of Anatolia, and through territories controlled by various Muslim rulers. Disease, starvation, and constant warfare took a terrible toll on the crusading armies, yet somehow, against all odds, the First Crusade succeeded. In 1099, after a brutal siege, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. The scenes that followed were horrific, even by medieval standards. The Crusaders massacred virtually the entire population of the city, Muslim and Jewish alike. Contemporary accounts describe streets running with blood and piles of severed heads and hands. The success of the First Crusade led to the establishment of 4 Crusader states in the Holy Land: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These were European colonies in the Middle East, ruled by Western nobles but populated by a mixture of Western settlers, Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews. The Crusader states were remarkable experiments in cross-cultural living. Despite the religious warfare that had brought them into being, daily life in these territories often involved peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange. Crusader nobles adopted Eastern customs, dress, and even architectural styles. They learned Arabic, employed Muslim administrators, and sometimes formed alliances with Muslim rulers against other Crusader lords. But the Crusader states were also inherently unstable. They were surrounded by hostile Muslim territories, dependent on a constant stream of reinforcements and supplies from Europe, and plagued by internal conflicts between different groups of settlers. The fall of Edessa to the Muslim leader Zengi in 1144 shocked Europe and prompted the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade, preached by the influential abbot Bernard of Clairvaux and led by the kings of France and Germany, was a disaster. The crusading armies were decimated in Anatolia, and their attempt to capture Damascus ended in humiliating failure. The Crusades' failure damaged the prestige of both the papacy and the European monarchs who had supported it. Meanwhile, in the Muslim world, a new leader was rising who would change the course of the Crusades forever. Saladin, a Kurdish general who had risen to power in Egypt and Syria, was both a brilliant military commander and a skilled diplomat. Unlike many of his predecessors, Saladin was able to unite the fractured Muslim world under his leadership and present a unified front against the Crusader states. In 1187, Saladin achieved what many had thought impossible. He recaptured Jerusalem. The Battle of Hattin, where Saladin destroyed the main Crusader army and captured the King of Jerusalem, was one of the most decisive battles of the medieval period. Unlike the Crusaders' massacre of 1199, Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem was marked by relative restraint and mercy. The fall of Jerusalem prompted the Third Crusade, the most famous of all the crusading expeditions. Led by 3 of Europe's most powerful rulers, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, this crusade captured the imagination of medieval Europe like no other. The Third Crusade was a study in both the possibilities and limitations of medieval warfare and diplomacy. Frederick Barbarossa, perhaps the most formidable of the 3 leaders, drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia, depriving the crusade of his leadership and much of his army. Philip Augustus and Richard quarreled constantly, with Philip eventually returning to France to plot against Richard's territories. Richard himself became a legendary figure, earning the nickname Lionheart for his courage and military skill. His battles with Saladin became the stuff of legend, with both leaders earning each other's respect despite their religious and political differences. But even Richard could not recapture Jerusalem. The Third Crusade ended with a treaty that allowed Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City, but left it under Muslim control. The later Crusades were increasingly desperate and unsuccessful attempts to reclaim what had been lost. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, never even reached the Holy Land. Instead, the Crusaders were diverted to Constantinople, which they captured and sacked in 1204. This attack on the Byzantine Empire, the very power that had originally requested Western help, was one of the most shameful episodes in crusading history. The sack of Constantinople had profound consequences for both East and West. It fatally weakened the Byzantine Empire, making it vulnerable to eventual conquest by the Ottoman Turks. It also deepened the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, creating wounds that have never fully healed. Later crusades continued to be launched throughout the 13th century, but with diminishing success. The Fifth Crusade attempted to conquer Egypt as a stepping stone to Jerusalem, but ended in failure. The Sixth Crusade, led by the excommunicated Emperor Frederick II, actually succeeded in regaining Jerusalem through diplomacy rather than warfare, but the city was lost again within 15 years. The final major crusading effort was led by King Louis VII of France, later canonized as Saint Louis. His first crusade in 1248 ended with his capture in Egypt. His second crusade in 1270 ended with his death from disease in Tunisia. With Louis's death, the age of the Great Crusades effectively came to an end. The last Crusader stronghold, the city of Acre, fell to the Mamluks in 1291, ending nearly 2 centuries of Western presence in the Holy Land. The Crusader states had lasted longer than many had expected, but they had ultimately failed to establish a permanent Western foothold in the Middle East. The impact of the Crusades on European civilization was enormous and complex. On one hand, they exposed Europeans to new ideas, technologies, and products from the East. Crusaders returned home with knowledge of Eastern medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. They brought back new foods, spices, and luxury goods that stimulated European trade and commerce. The Crusades also had important political consequences. They strengthened the power of the papacy, which had organized and directed the crusading movement. They contributed to the development of military orders like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, which became powerful political and economic forces in their own right. But the Crusades also had a dark legacy. They institutionalized religious warfare and created lasting hostility between Christians and Muslims. They led to massacres of Jews in Europe, as well as Muslims in the Holy Land. They diverted resources and attention from other pressing problems and contributed to the impoverishment of many European regions. Perhaps most importantly, the Crusades marked the beginning of European expansion beyond the continent's borders. They established patterns of conquest, colonization, and cultural conflict that would be repeated in later centuries in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. In this sense, the Crusades were not just a medieval phenomenon, but the beginning of a process that would ultimately lead to European domination of much of the world. The crusading ideal continued to influence European thought and culture long after the last Crusader stronghold had fallen. The notion of holy war, of fighting for God and faith, became deeply embedded in European consciousness. The chivalric ideals associated with the Crusades, courage, honor, and devotion to a sacred cause, continued to inspire European literature and culture for centuries. In the end, the Crusades were both a failure and a success. They failed in their stated goal of permanently establishing Christian control over the Holy Land. But they succeeded in transforming European civilization, opening it to new influences and ideas, and setting it on a path toward global expansion and influence that would define the next several centuries of world history. While knights were fighting in the Holy Land and peasants were toiling in the fields, something revolutionary was happening in medieval Europe that would ultimately prove more important than any crusade or feudal war: the rise of towns and the rebirth of trade. This urban revolution, which began in the 11th century and accelerated throughout the High Middle Ages, would fundamentally transform European society and lay the foundation for the modern world. The revival of trade began slowly, almost imperceptibly. In the early medieval period, most commerce had been local and limited. People produced what they needed and traded only for essentials they couldn't make themselves. Money was scarce, and most transactions were conducted through barter. The great trade networks that had connected the Roman Empire had largely collapsed, leaving Europe economically fragmented and isolated. But by the year 1000, things were beginning to change. The population was growing, agricultural productivity was improving, and political stability was increasing. These changes created both the demand for trade and the conditions that made it possible. Merchants began to venture beyond their local markets, carrying goods from one region to another and discovering that there were profits to be made in long-distance commerce. The Italian city-states were among the first to capitalize on these new opportunities. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa had maintained some commercial connections throughout the early medieval period, and they were perfectly positioned to take advantage of the growing demand for Eastern goods. Venice, in particular, had special trading privileges with the Byzantine Empire that gave it access to the luxury goods of the East: silk, spices, precious stones, and exotic foods that were eagerly sought after by Europe's growing wealthy class. The Crusades, for all their religious motivation, provided a tremendous stimulus to this revival of trade. The movement of hundreds of thousands of people to the Holy Land created an enormous demand for ships, supplies, and transportation. Italian merchants made fortunes provisioning the crusading armies and transporting pilgrims and warriors to the East. More importantly, the Crusades exposed Europeans to the wealth and sophistication of Eastern civilization, creating new demands for luxury goods and exotic products. But trade wasn't limited to luxury items. As Europe's population grew and became more specialized, there was increasing demand for basic commodities as well. The wool produced by English sheep was in high demand in the textile centers of Flanders, where skilled craftsmen turned it into fine cloth that was sold throughout Europe. The silver mines of Germany provided the currency that made long-distance trade possible. The grain of Sicily and southern Italy fed the growing populations of the northern cities. The revival of trade led inevitably to the growth of towns. Merchants needed places to store their goods, conduct their business, and find protection from bandits and hostile nobles. They gravitated toward locations that offered natural advantages: river crossings, mountain passes, harbors, or the intersections of major trade routes. Many of these trading centers grew up around existing settlements, monasteries, castles, or ancient Roman towns, but others were entirely new creations. These new towns were unlike anything Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. They were centers of commerce and industry, populated by merchants, craftsmen, and laborers who lived by trade rather than agriculture. They were cosmopolitan places where people from different regions and cultures came together to do business, and they were increasingly independent, governed by their own laws and customs rather than by feudal lords. The growth of towns created a new social class that didn't fit neatly into the traditional feudal hierarchy. Merchants and craftsmen were neither nobles nor peasants, neither warriors nor farmers. They were something new, a middle class whose wealth came from commerce and industry rather than land. This new class would eventually challenge the dominance of the feudal nobility and transform European society. The towns also developed new forms of government that were more democratic and representative than feudal monarchy. Many towns were governed by councils of leading citizens, elected mayors, or guilds of merchants and craftsmen. These urban governments were primarily concerned with protecting trade and maintaining order, but they also provided services that were unknown in the countryside: paved streets, public fountains, hospitals, and schools. The guild system that developed in medieval towns was one of the most important innovations of the period. Guilds were associations of merchants or craftsmen who worked in the same trade. They regulated the quality of goods, controlled prices, and limited competition. They also provided social services for their members: care for widows and orphans, support for members who fell ill, and proper burial for the dead. The merchant guilds were typically the most powerful, controlling long-distance trade and often dominating town government. But craft guilds were equally important in their own spheres. There were guilds for every conceivable trade: bakers, brewers, butchers, carpenters, masons, goldsmiths, weavers, dyers, and dozens of others. Each guild had its own rules, its own patron saint, and its own elaborate ceremonies and rituals. The guild system provided training and advancement opportunities that were unknown in feudal society. A young man could begin as an apprentice, learning his trade while living in his master's household. After several years, he could become a journeyman, working for wages and traveling from town to town to perfect his skills. Eventually, if he could demonstrate his competence and pay the required fees, he could become a master craftsman with his own shop and apprentices. This system of apprenticeship and advancement created a skilled workforce that was the foundation of medieval urban prosperity. The quality of medieval craftsmanship, from the intricate stonework of Gothic cathedrals to the fine textiles of Flemish weavers, was a direct result of this system of training and quality control. The revival of trade also led to important innovations in business practices and financial techniques. Italian merchants developed new forms of partnership and investment that allowed them to pool resources and share risks. They created sophisticated accounting systems that tracked profits and losses across multiple ventures and locations. They developed letters of credit that allowed merchants to conduct business without carrying large amounts of cash across dangerous roads. Perhaps most importantly, they developed banking. The great banking houses of medieval Italy, the Medici of Florence, the Fuggers of Augsburg, the Lombards who gave their name to London's financial district, provided the capital that made large-scale commerce possible. They lent money to merchants, exchanged currencies, and transferred funds across vast distances. Without their services, the commercial revolution of the High Middle Ages would have been impossible. The growth of towns and trade also had important cultural consequences. Towns were centers of learning and innovation, where new ideas could spread rapidly and where different cultures came into contact. The first universities were founded in towns, and urban schools provided education for the children of merchants and craftsmen as well as nobles. Towns were also centers of artistic and architectural innovation. The great Gothic cathedrals were urban projects, financed by wealthy merchants and built by skilled urban craftsmen. The elaborate town halls, guild halls, and private mansions of medieval towns showcased new architectural styles and decorative techniques. By the 13th century, the urban revolution had transformed European society. Towns had become centers of wealth and power that rivaled the feudal nobility. Merchants had become a political force that kings and nobles had to reckon with. Trade had created connections between distant regions and cultures that would never again be broken. The rise of towns and trade marked the beginning of the end of feudalism. The new wealth created by commerce gave people alternatives to the traditional feudal relationships. Peasants could escape to the towns, where they could earn wages and eventually buy their freedom. Nobles found that they needed money more than military service, and they began to commute feudal obligations into cash payments. Most importantly, the urban revolution created the economic foundation for all the other achievements of medieval civilization. The wealth generated by trade financed the crusades, built the cathedrals, supported the universities, and patronized the arts. Without the commercial revolution of the High Middle Ages, the flowering of medieval culture would have been impossible. The rise of towns and trade was perhaps the most important development of the medieval period, more significant in the long run than any political or military event. It created the economic and social foundations of the modern world and set Europe on the path toward global dominance that would characterize the next several centuries of world history. In the year 1144, Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis stood in his newly rebuilt abbey church near Paris and witnessed something that had never been seen before in European architecture. Light, pure, brilliant colored light, streamed through enormous windows, transforming the interior space into something that seemed more heavenly than earthly. This moment marked the birth of Gothic architecture, one of medieval Europe's greatest achievements, and a testament to the faith, skill, and ambition of an entire civilization. The Gothic Revolution didn't happen overnight. It grew out of centuries of architectural experimentation and the accumulated knowledge of countless master builders, stonemasons, and craftsmen. But it also reflected something deeper, a new understanding of the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds, and a burning desire to create buildings that would lift the human soul toward God. The story begins with the Romanesque style that had dominated European architecture since the Carolingian period. Romanesque churches were solid, massive structures with thick walls, small windows, and heavy barrel vaults. They were impressive in their own way, conveying a sense of strength and permanence that reflected the turbulent times in which they were built. But they were also dark and somewhat oppressive, their thick walls necessary to support the enormous weight of their stone roofs, but blocking out much of the natural light that medieval people associated with the divine. The breakthrough that made Gothic architecture possible was the development of the pointed arch. This seemingly simple innovation, borrowed from Islamic architecture and refined by European builders, had revolutionary implications. Unlike the rounded Roman arch, which directed its weight straight down, the pointed arch directed weight both down and outward. This meant that the walls no longer had to bear all the weight of the roof. Much of it could be carried by external supports called flying buttresses. With the walls freed from their load-bearing function, they could be opened up with enormous windows, and these windows could be filled with stained glass, creating the luminous interiors that became the hallmark of Gothic architecture. The effect was transformational, literally and figuratively. These buildings seemed to defy gravity, reaching toward heaven with their soaring spires and filling their interiors with colored light that medieval people interpreted as a glimpse of the divine glory. The construction of a Gothic cathedral was one of the most complex and ambitious undertakings of the medieval world. It required the coordination of hundreds of skilled craftsmen, the investment of enormous financial resources, and the sustained commitment of entire communities over periods that often stretched across multiple generations. The process began with the selection of a master builder, a man who combined the skills of an architect, engineer, and project manager. These master builders were among the most respected and well-paid professionals of their time, traveling from project to project and commanding salaries that rivaled those of nobles. They worked without the benefit of detailed blueprints or mathematical calculations, relying instead on practical experience, geometric principles, and an intuitive understanding of structural forces. The master builder would begin by laying out the plan of the cathedral on the ground, using ropes and stakes to mark the positions of walls, columns, and other structural elements. The foundation would then be excavated, often requiring the removal of enormous quantities of earth and rock. The foundations themselves had to be massive and deep, capable of supporting structures that might rise 300 feet or more into the air. The construction process required an army of specialized craftsmen. Stonemasons cut and shaped the individual blocks that would form the walls and vaults. Carpenters built the wooden scaffolding and centering that supported the stone arches during construction. Mortar makers prepared the lime-based cement that held the stones together. Glaziers created the stained glass windows that would fill the building with colored light. Each of these crafts required years of training and experience. A stonemason had to understand not only how to cut stone, but also how different types of stone behaved under stress, how to select the best pieces for different parts of the structure, and how to work with the other craftsmen to ensure that all the elements fit together perfectly. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. A mistake in the cutting of a keystone or the calculation of an arch could bring down an entire section of the building. The logistics of cathedral construction were staggering. The stone had to be quarried, often from sites many miles away, and transported to the building site by ox cart or river barge. A single cathedral might require hundreds of thousands of individual stones, each one cut to precise specifications. The timber for scaffolding and roof structures came from entire forests. The lead for the roof and the iron for reinforcement had to be mined, smelted, and shaped by specialized craftsmen. The financial resources required were equally enormous. The construction of a major cathedral could cost as much as a royal palace or a military campaign. The money came from a variety of sources: donations from wealthy nobles and merchants, contributions from ordinary citizens, revenues from church lands, and sometimes special taxes or indulgences. The construction of Notre Dame de Paris, begun in 1163, required the resources of the entire city and took nearly 2 centuries to complete. But cathedrals were more than just architectural achievements. They were also centers of community life and expressions of civic pride. The decision to build a cathedral was often made by the entire community, and its construction became a shared enterprise that united people across social and economic divisions. Wealthy merchants might donate money for windows or chapels, while ordinary citizens contributed their labor or materials. Even the poorest members of the community could participate by carrying stones or mixing mortar. The construction site itself became a kind of temporary city, with workshops, living quarters, and storage areas clustered around the rising structure. Master craftsmen from across Europe might work side by side with local laborers, sharing techniques and innovations that would spread to other projects. The cathedral building sites were centers of technological innovation, where new tools, techniques, and architectural solutions were developed and tested. The decorative programs of Gothic cathedrals were as ambitious as their architecture. The facades were covered with hundreds of carved figures, saints, kings, prophets, and ordinary people that told the stories of the Bible and the history of the Church. These sculptures served as books in stone for a largely illiterate population, teaching religious doctrine and moral lessons through visual imagery. The stained glass windows were equally instructive and even more spectacular. Master glaziers developed techniques for creating glass in dozens of different colors and for assembling these pieces into complex narrative scenes. The windows of Chartres Cathedral, created in the early 13th century, are among the finest examples of medieval art, combining technical mastery with profound spiritual expression. The rose windows that adorned the facades of many Gothic cathedrals were particular marvels of engineering and artistry. These enormous circular windows, sometimes more than 40 feet in diameter, required precise calculation to ensure that their delicate stone tracery could support the weight of the glass while maintaining perfect geometric proportions. The construction of Gothic cathedrals also drove important technological innovations. The development of more sophisticated lifting devices allowed builders to raise heavy stones to unprecedented heights. New techniques for cutting and shaping stone made possible the intricate decorative details that characterized Gothic architecture. The use of iron reinforcement helped to strengthen the thin stone members that carried the structural loads. Perhaps most importantly, the cathedral builders developed new methods for training and organizing skilled craftsmen. The lodge system that grew up around cathedral construction sites became the model for craft guilds throughout Europe. Master builders developed systematic methods for teaching their skills to apprentices and journeymen, ensuring that the knowledge accumulated over generations of construction would not be lost. The Gothic cathedrals were not just buildings, they were expressions of an entire civilization's highest aspirations. They represented the medieval synthesis of faith and reason, of spiritual devotion and technical mastery, of individual skill and communal effort. They were monuments to human creativity and divine inspiration, reaching toward heaven while remaining firmly rooted in the earth. The age of cathedral building reached its peak in the 13th century, when cities across Europe competed to build ever more magnificent structures. The cathedrals of Paris, Chartres, Reims, Amiens, and Cologne became models that were copied and adapted throughout the continent. Each new cathedral incorporated innovations and improvements developed at earlier sites, creating a continuous tradition of architectural evolution and refinement. But the cathedrals were also products of their time, reflecting the prosperity, confidence, and spiritual fervor of the High Middle Ages. As the medieval world began to change in the 14th and 15th centuries, the age of great cathedral building gradually came to an end. The resources and communal spirit that had made these projects possible were redirected toward other goals, and new architectural styles began to emerge that reflected different values and aspirations. Yet the Gothic cathedrals remain among humanity's greatest achievements, testaments to what can be accomplished when technical skill is combined with spiritual vision and communal commitment. They continue to inspire awe and wonder, more than 8 centuries after their construction, reminding us of the heights that human creativity can reach when it is directed toward transcendent goals. While master builders were raising Gothic cathedrals toward heaven, another revolution was taking place in the schools and universities of medieval Europe. This intellectual awakening, known as scholasticism, would transform European thought and lay the foundation for the scientific and philosophical achievements of later centuries. The roots of this revolution lay in the rediscovery of ancient learning, particularly the works of Aristotle. For centuries, European scholars had known Aristotle primarily through fragments and summaries preserved by early Christian writers, but in the 12th and 13th centuries, complete texts of Aristotle's works began to reach Western Europe, translated from Arabic versions that had been preserved and studied by Muslim scholars in Spain and the Middle East. This influx of new knowledge created both excitement and anxiety in the Christian world. Aristotle's works contained sophisticated discussions of logic, natural philosophy, ethics, and politics that far surpassed anything available in the early medieval period. But they also contained ideas that seemed to conflict with Christian doctrine. Aristotle argued that the world was eternal rather than created, that the soul might not be immortal, and that reason alone could discover truth about the natural world. The challenge facing medieval scholars was how to reconcile this new learning with Christian faith. Could reason and revelation coexist? Could the truths discovered by pagan philosophers be integrated with the truths revealed by God? These questions would occupy some of the greatest minds of the medieval period and lead to the development of new methods of inquiry and argumentation. The institutional setting for this intellectual revolution was the university, a new type of educational institution that emerged in the 12th century. The first universities grew out of cathedral schools and monastic schools that had provided basic education for clergy. But as the demand for educated administrators, lawyers, and teachers grew, these schools expanded their curricula and attracted students from across Europe. The University of Bologna, founded around 1088, specialized in law and became the model for universities throughout southern Europe. The University of Paris, which emerged from the Cathedral School of Notre Dame in the early 12th century, focused on theology and philosophy and became the intellectual center of northern Europe. Oxford and Cambridge in England, Salamanca in Spain, and dozens of other universities followed, creating a network of educational institutions that spanned the continent. These universities were unlike anything that had existed before. They were international institutions where students and teachers from different countries came together to pursue learning. They had their own laws, their own courts, and their own privileges that protected them from interference by local authorities. They developed standardized curricula and degree requirements that were recognized throughout Europe. The heart of university education was the liberal arts curriculum, based on the 7 liberal arts that had been defined in the early medieval period: grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, the trivium, and arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the quadrivium. Students typically spent 4 to 6 years mastering these subjects before proceeding to advanced study in theology, law, or medicine. But the real innovation of the medieval universities was their method of instruction and inquiry. The scholastic method, as it came to be known, was based on the systematic examination of authoritative texts and the resolution of apparent contradictions through logical analysis. Students learned not just to memorize information, but to think critically about complex problems and to construct logical arguments. The typical university class was structured around the lectio, lecture, and the disputatio, disputation. In the lecture, the master would read and comment on an authoritative text, explaining difficult passages and relating them to other sources. In the disputation, students would debate specific questions, presenting arguments on both sides and attempting to reach reasoned conclusions. This method of instruction produced a new type of intellectual, the scholastic philosopher-theologian who could navigate between faith and reason, authority and logic, tradition and innovation. The greatest of these figures was Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar who taught at the University of Paris in the mid-13th century. Aquinas undertook the monumental task of creating a comprehensive synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. His masterwork, the Summa Theologica, addressed virtually every major question of medieval thought: the existence and nature of God, the relationship between faith and reason, the nature of the human soul, the principles of ethics and politics, and the structure of the natural world. Aquinas argued that reason and faith were complementary rather than contradictory. Reason could discover many truths about God and the natural world, but revelation was necessary for truths that exceeded human understanding. This synthesis allowed medieval scholars to embrace Aristotelian learning while maintaining their Christian commitments. The influence of Aquinas and other scholastic thinkers extended far beyond the universities. Their methods of logical analysis were applied to law, where scholars like Gratian created systematic compilations of canon law that reconciled conflicting authorities. They were applied to theology, where the great theological summae provided comprehensive treatments of Christian doctrine. They were even applied to politics, where thinkers like Aquinas and Marsilius of Padua developed sophisticated theories of government and political authority. The scholastic method also had important implications for the development of science. Medieval scholars developed rigorous methods for analyzing natural phenomena, conducting logical arguments about physical processes, and testing theoretical conclusions against empirical observations. While they did not develop the experimental method that would characterize modern science, they laid important groundwork for later scientific developments. The universities also played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting knowledge. University libraries collected manuscripts from across Europe and beyond, creating repositories of learning that far exceeded anything available in the early medieval period. University scribes copied and distributed texts, ensuring that important works would not be lost. University scholars wrote commentaries and summaries that made complex works accessible to broader audiences. Perhaps most importantly, the universities created a new class of educated professionals who would transform European society. University graduates became administrators in royal and ecclesiastical bureaucracies, judges in the expanding court systems, teachers in schools throughout Europe, and advisors to kings and popes. They brought with them the analytical methods and intellectual habits they had learned in the universities, gradually transforming the way European society approached complex problems. The Scholastic Revolution also had important cultural implications. The emphasis on logical analysis and systematic argumentation influenced literature, art, and architecture. The Gothic cathedrals, with their complex structural systems and elaborate decorative programs, reflected the same systematic approach to complex problems that characterized scholastic philosophy. The great literary works of the period, from Dante's Divine Comedy to the Arthurian romances, showed the influence of scholastic methods of organization and analysis. The universities also fostered a new sense of European intellectual unity. Students and teachers moved freely between universities, creating networks of scholarly communication that transcended political boundaries. Latin remained the universal language of learning, allowing scholars from different countries to communicate and collaborate. The standardization of curricula and degree requirements meant that a master's degree from Paris was recognized in Oxford, Bologna, or Salamanca. By the end of the 13th century, the Scholastic Revolution had fundamentally transformed European intellectual life. The universities had become permanent fixtures of European civilization, producing the educated professionals that increasingly complex societies required. The scholastic method had provided new tools for analyzing complex problems and reconciling conflicting authorities. The synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology had created a comprehensive worldview that would dominate European thought for centuries. But perhaps most importantly, the Scholastic Revolution had demonstrated that human reason could be a powerful tool for understanding both the natural world and divine truth. This confidence in the power of reason would eventually lead to the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries and the Enlightenment of the 18th century. In this sense, the medieval universities and their scholastic methods were not just products of their time, but foundations for the intellectual achievements of the modern world. The Scholastic Revolution showed that the medieval period was not an age of intellectual stagnation, but one of remarkable creativity and innovation. The scholars of the High Middle Ages created new institutions, developed new methods of inquiry, and achieved new syntheses of knowledge that would influence European civilization for centuries to come. In the autumn of 1347, 12 Genoese galleys limped into the harbor of Caffa, a trading post on the Black Sea. The ships carried more than silk and spices from the east. They carried death itself. The plague that would become known as the Black Death had arrived in Europe, and nothing would ever be the same again. The disease had originated in Central Asia, spreading along the trade routes that connected east and west. It traveled with merchants and armies, carried by the fleas that lived on black rats, those unwelcome passengers on every medieval ship and caravan. By the time it reached the Black Sea, it had already devastated much of Asia and the Middle East. Now it was Europe's turn. The plague spread with terrifying speed. From the ports of the Mediterranean, it followed the trade routes inland, reaching Paris by 1348, London by 1349, and the remote villages of Scotland and Scandinavia by 1350. No corner of Europe was spared. The disease moved faster than news of its approach, striking communities that had no warning and no understanding of what was happening to them. The symptoms were horrifying and unmistakable. Victims developed painful swellings called buboes in their groin, armpits, and neck. These swellings could grow as large as apples and were excruciatingly painful. Dark spots appeared on the skin, giving the disease its popular name. Fever, chills, and vomiting followed, and death usually came within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms. But there was an even more deadly form of the plague, pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and could be spread directly from person to person through coughing and sneezing. This form killed even more quickly, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms, and was nearly 100% fatal. Medieval medicine was helpless against the plague. Doctors had no understanding of how diseases spread and no effective treatments. They tried bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies, but nothing worked. Many physicians fled their posts, while others died alongside their patients. The few who remained often did more harm than good with their desperate treatments. The mortality rate was staggering. In some communities, half the population died within a few months. In others, the death toll reached 60 or even 70%. Entire villages were abandoned, their populations wiped out completely. Cities that had thrived for centuries were reduced to ghost towns, their streets littered with corpses that no one was left to bury. The social fabric of medieval Europe began to unravel. Traditional authorities, kings, nobles, clergy, proved powerless against the plague. Many fled to the countryside, abandoning their responsibilities and their subjects. The Church, which had provided comfort and guidance through previous crises, was particularly hard hit. Priests and monks, who ministered to the sick and dying, died in disproportionate numbers. Some monasteries lost their entire communities. The economic consequences were equally devastating. Trade ground to a halt as merchants died or fled. Agricultural production collapsed as peasants abandoned their fields or died before the harvest. Entire industries disappeared overnight. The complex commercial networks that had developed during the High Middle Ages were shattered, and it would take generations to rebuild them. But perhaps the most profound impact of the Black Death was psychological. Medieval people had believed that God controlled all aspects of life, that suffering was meaningful, and that the Church could provide protection and salvation. The plague challenged all of these beliefs. Why would a just God allow such indiscriminate slaughter? Why did prayer and penance seem to have no effect? Why did the clergy die alongside everyone else? Some people responded to these questions with increased religious fervor. Groups of flagellants wandered from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, believing that their suffering might appease God's wrath. Others turned to mysticism, seeking direct personal experience of the divine rather than relying on the institutional church. But many people lost faith altogether. They turned to hedonism, believing that if death could come at any moment, they might as well enjoy life while they could. Others became fatalistic, accepting that human effort was meaningless in the face of divine wrath or cosmic indifference. The plague also unleashed waves of persecution against minority groups. Jews were blamed for causing the plague by poisoning wells, despite the fact that they died from the disease at the same rates as Christians. Entire Jewish communities were massacred in Germany, France, and other parts of Europe. Other groups, lepers, beggars, foreigners, were also scapegoated and attacked. Yet, even as the plague devastated Europe, it also created opportunities for those who survived. The massive death toll led to severe labor shortages, which gave surviving workers unprecedented bargaining power. Peasants who had been bound to the land for generations suddenly found themselves in demand and able to negotiate better terms with their lords. In England, the Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from moving in search of better opportunities. But the law was largely unenforceable. Workers simply ignored it, moving to wherever they could get the best terms. Similar laws in other countries were equally unsuccessful. The result was a fundamental shift in the relationship between lords and peasants. The rigid hierarchies of feudalism began to break down as economic relationships became more important than traditional bonds of loyalty and obligation. Money became more important than land, and individual initiative more valuable than inherited status. The plague also accelerated the decline of the manorial system. Many manors were abandoned or consolidated as their populations died out. Surviving lords often found it more profitable to lease their land to tenant farmers, rather than trying to maintain the complex system of feudal obligations. This shift toward commercial agriculture would have profound long-term consequences for European society. In the towns, the plague led to significant social and political changes. The death of so many established merchants and craftsmen created opportunities for newcomers to rise in society. Guild restrictions that had limited competition were relaxed out of necessity. New forms of business organization emerged to replace the family-based enterprises that had been wiped out by the plague. The church, too, was transformed by the plague experience. The massive death toll among the clergy led to a crisis of leadership and authority. Many positions were filled by hastily trained and poorly educated replacements. The quality of pastoral care declined, and popular respect for the clergy diminished. This crisis of authority contributed to the rise of popular religious movements that challenged the institutional church. John Wycliffe in England and John Huss in Bohemia preached that individuals could have direct relationships with God without the mediation of priests. These ideas would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. The plague also had important cultural consequences. The constant presence of death led to new forms of artistic expression. The dance of death became a popular theme in art and literature, depicting death as the great equalizer who claimed kings and peasants alike. Gothic art became more realistic and emotional, reflecting the harsh realities of plague-ravaged Europe. Literature, too, was transformed by the plague experience. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague years, used the framework of people telling stories while sheltering from the disease to explore themes of love, death, and human nature. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written later in the century, reflected the social changes brought about by the plague, depicting a society in transition where traditional hierarchies were breaking down. The Black Death marked the end of the High Middle Ages and the beginning of a new era in European history. The confident, expanding civilization of the 12th and 13th centuries gave way to a more troubled and uncertain world. The plague had shown that human achievements, the great cathedrals, the universities, the commercial networks, were fragile and could be swept away in a matter of months. But the plague also demonstrated human resilience and adaptability. European society did not collapse entirely. Instead, it adapted to new circumstances, developing new institutions and new ways of organizing social and economic life. The survivors of the Black Death built a different kind of civilization, more individualistic, more commercial, more skeptical of traditional authorities, but a civilization nonetheless. The demographic recovery from the plague was slow. It took more than a century for Europe's population to return to pre-plague levels. But when it did, it was a different Europe, more urban, more commercial, more politically centralized, and more culturally diverse. The seeds of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Exploration had all been planted in the plague-ravaged soil of the 14th century. The Black Death was one of the great turning points in human history, comparable to the fall of Rome or the Industrial Revolution. It ended one era and began another, transforming not just the demographics of Europe, but its entire social, economic, and cultural structure. The medieval world that emerged from the plague was recognizably different from what had come before, and it would continue to evolve in directions that the survivors of the Black Death could never have imagined. As Europe slowly recovered from the devastation of the Black Death, a new world began to emerge from the ashes of the old. The 14th and 15th centuries were a time of profound transformation, as the medieval synthesis that had characterized the High Middle Ages gave way to new forms of political organization, economic activity, and cultural expression. The most visible change was political. The decentralized feudal monarchies of the earlier period were gradually replaced by more centralized nation-states. Kings who had once been little more than first among equals began to assert real authority over their territories, building professional armies, establishing royal courts, and creating bureaucratic administrations that could govern effectively without relying on feudal obligations. This process of centralization was driven partly by military necessity. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which began in 1337 and continued intermittently until 1453, demonstrated the advantages of centralized military organization. The English victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were achieved by professional armies using new military technologies, particularly the longbow and later gunpowder weapons, that made traditional feudal cavalry obsolete. The French response to these defeats was to create a more centralized military system. Under kings like Charles VII and Louis XV, France developed a standing army, a royal artillery, and a system of taxation that could support professional soldiers year-round. This new military system not only enabled France to eventually win the 100 Years' War, but also gave the French monarchy the power to impose its authority throughout the kingdom. Similar processes were occurring throughout Europe. In England, the Wars of the Roses, which raged from 1455 to 1487, ended with the victory of Henry Tudor, who established a strong monarchical government that would dominate English politics for the next century. In Spain, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 created a unified kingdom that would become one of Europe's most powerful states. The Holy Roman Empire, by contrast, failed to achieve this kind of centralization. The empire remained a loose confederation of hundreds of semi-independent territories, each with its own laws, customs, and rulers. This fragmentation would have important consequences for German development and would contribute to the religious and political conflicts of the 16th century. The rise of centralized monarchies was accompanied by important changes in the nature of warfare. The introduction of gunpowder weapons, cannons, handguns, and later muskets, revolutionized military tactics and strategy. Castles, which had been the dominant form of fortification throughout the medieval period, became obsolete almost overnight. Cannon could breach walls that had withstood siege for months, and the high, thin walls of medieval castles were particularly vulnerable to artillery fire. The response was the development of new forms of fortification, low, thick walls designed to absorb cannon fire, and elaborate systems of bastions and ravelins that could provide covering fire against attacking forces. These new fortifications were enormously expensive to build and maintain, giving further advantages to centralized states that could mobilize the necessary resources. The economic changes of the late medieval period were equally profound. The commercial revolution that had begun in the High Middle Ages continued and accelerated, but it took new forms. The great Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Florence, remained important commercial centers, but they were increasingly challenged by new competitors from Northern Europe. The Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant cities centered on Lübeck and Hamburg, dominated trade in the Baltic and North Seas. English merchants, backed by royal support, began to challenge Italian dominance in the cloth trade. The discovery of new silver mines in Central Europe provided the currency needed to support expanding commercial networks. Perhaps most importantly, European merchants began to look beyond the traditional trade routes to the east. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 disrupted the established routes to Asia and made Eastern goods more expensive and difficult to obtain. This created incentives for European merchants to find new routes to the east, incentives that would eventually lead to the Age of Exploration. The cultural changes of the late medieval period were equally significant. The confident synthesis of faith and reason that had characterized the High Middle Ages began to break down. The plague had shaken people's faith in traditional authorities, and new intellectual currents began to emerge that challenged established ways of thinking. Humanism, which began in Italy in the 14th century, represented a new approach to learning and culture. Humanist scholars like Petrarch and Boccaccio turned away from the scholastic methods of the universities and instead sought to recover and imitate the literature and culture of classical antiquity. They believed that the study of classical texts could provide moral guidance and cultural refinement that was superior to medieval learning. This humanist movement had important implications for education, literature, and art. Humanist schools began to teach classical languages and literature rather than the traditional medieval curriculum. Writers began to compose works in vernacular languages rather than Latin, making literature accessible to broader audiences. Artists began to study classical models and to develop new techniques for representing the natural world. The invention of printing, which occurred in the mid-15th century, accelerated these cultural changes. Books, which had been rare and expensive manuscripts copied by hand, could now be produced quickly and cheaply. This made knowledge more widely available and helped to spread new ideas throughout Europe. The printing press also had important religious implications. The Bible, which had previously been available only in expensive manuscript copies, could now be printed in large quantities and in vernacular languages. This made it possible for ordinary people to read Scripture for themselves rather than relying on the interpretation of priests. These developments contributed to growing criticism of the institutional church. The Great Schism, which lasted from 1378 to 1417 and saw rival popes claiming authority in Rome and Avignon, had damaged the Church's prestige and credibility. The conciliar movement, which attempted to reform the Church by making councils of bishops superior to the Pope, challenged traditional notions of papal authority. Popular religious movements also began to challenge the Church's monopoly on spiritual authority. The Devotio Moderna, which originated in the Netherlands, emphasized personal piety and direct relationship with God rather than elaborate theological speculation. Mystics like Meister Eckhart and Johannes Tauler taught that individuals could achieve direct union with God through contemplation and prayer. These religious developments would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, but they were already transforming European Christianity in the late medieval period. The Church remained powerful and influential, but it no longer enjoyed the unchallenged authority it had possessed in the High Middle Ages. The late medieval period also saw important developments in art and architecture. The Gothic style continued to evolve, becoming more elaborate and decorative. The flamboyant Gothic of the 15th century featured intricate stone tracery, elaborate sculptural programs, and increasingly complex structural systems. But new artistic styles were also emerging, particularly in Italy. The Renaissance, which began in Florence in the early 15th century, represented a conscious attempt to revive the artistic traditions of classical antiquity. Artists like Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Masaccio developed new techniques for representing space, light, and human anatomy that would revolutionize European art. These artistic innovations reflected broader cultural changes. The Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement, classical learning, and naturalistic representation was part of a larger shift away from the corporate, religious culture of the High Middle Ages toward a more secular, individualistic worldview. By the end of the 15th century, medieval Europe was transforming itself into something recognizably modern. The centralized nation-states, the global commercial networks, the printing press, and the new artistic and intellectual movements were all laying the foundation for the dramatic changes that would characterize the early modern period. The medieval world was not ending with a bang, but with a gradual transformation that would accelerate in the 16th century. The Age of Exploration, the Protestant Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution were all products of developments that had begun in the late medieval period. The thousand-year journey from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the modern world was nearing its end, but the civilization that emerged from this long transformation would carry forward many of the achievements and innovations of the medieval centuries. As we reach the end of our journey through 1,000 years of medieval European history, it's worth reflecting on what this remarkable period accomplished and how it continues to shape our world today. The medieval centuries were not a dark interlude between the glories of antiquity and the achievements of the modern world. They were a time of extraordinary creativity, innovation, and human achievement that laid the foundation for everything that followed. Consider what medieval Europe created from the chaos that followed Rome's fall. They built new forms of government that balanced central authority with local autonomy, creating the political structures that would eventually evolve into modern democratic states. The English Parliament, which emerged from medieval royal councils, became the model for representative government throughout the world. The concept of constitutional monarchy, which limits royal power through law and custom, was a medieval innovation that continues to influence political systems today. Medieval Europeans also created new forms of economic organization that made possible the commercial revolution of the later Middle Ages and the global economy of the modern world. The banking systems developed by Italian merchants, the commercial law created by medieval jurists, and the trading networks that connected Europe to Asia and Africa all provided the foundation for later economic development. The guild system, for all its limitations, created the first systematic methods for training skilled workers and maintaining quality standards. The apprenticeship system that emerged from medieval guilds continues to influence vocational education today. The concept of professional standards and ethical obligations that characterizes modern professions has its roots in medieval guild practices. Medieval Europe also made crucial contributions to the development of technology and science. The heavy plow, the horse collar, and the three-field system revolutionized agriculture and made possible the population growth that characterized the High Middle Ages. The windmill and the watermill provided new sources of power that would eventually lead to the Industrial Revolution. Medieval scholars preserved and transmitted the learning of antiquity, while adding their own innovations and discoveries. The universities they created became the model for higher education throughout the world. The scholastic method they developed provided the logical and analytical tools that would eventually lead to the scientific revolution. The legal systems created in medieval Europe continue to influence law throughout the world. The English common law system, which emerged from medieval royal courts, is still used in many countries today. The canon law developed by the medieval church influenced the development of international law and human rights concepts. Medieval architecture gave us some of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. The Gothic cathedrals remain among the most impressive buildings ever constructed, demonstrating what human creativity and determination can accomplish when directed toward transcendent goals. The engineering innovations developed by medieval builders, the pointed arch, the flying buttress, the ribbed vault, influenced architecture for centuries and continue to inspire architects today. Medieval literature created many of the narrative forms and themes that continue to influence storytelling today. The Arthurian legends, the chansons de geste, and the courtly romances established patterns of heroic narrative that can still be seen in modern films and novels. The concept of romantic love, which emerged from medieval courtly culture, continues to shape how we think about relationships and marriage. The medieval synthesis of classical learning, Christian faith, and Germanic traditions created a distinctive European culture that would eventually spread throughout the world. The values of individual dignity, personal responsibility, and limited government that characterize Western civilization all have their roots in medieval developments. But perhaps most importantly, medieval Europe demonstrated the human capacity for resilience, adaptation, and renewal. When the Roman Empire collapsed, it seemed as though European civilization might disappear entirely. Cities were abandoned, trade networks collapsed, literacy declined, and political authority fragmented. Yet from this apparent catastrophe, medieval Europeans built something new and in many ways superior to what had been lost. They showed that civilization is not a fragile flower that withers at the first sign of trouble, but a hardy plant that can survive the harshest winters and bloom again in spring. When the Vikings terrorized the coasts, Europeans built better defenses and eventually integrated the Vikings into their own societies. When the plague devastated the population, survivors adapted to new circumstances and created new forms of social and economic organization. This resilience was not just a matter of survival, it was creative adaptation that often led to genuine improvement. The feudal system that emerged from the collapse of central authority was in many ways more flexible and responsive to local needs than the rigid imperial bureaucracy it replaced. The medieval economy, based on personal relationships and mutual obligation, was more stable and sustainable than the slave-based economy of Rome. Medieval Europeans also demonstrated the power of faith and shared values to unite diverse peoples and create common purpose. The Christian Church provided a unifying force that transcended political boundaries and ethnic divisions. The ideal of Christendom, a unified Christian civilization, inspired some of the greatest achievements of the medieval period, from the crusades to the cathedrals to the universities. This is not to romanticize the medieval period or ignore its darker aspects. Medieval Europe was a violent, hierarchical society where most people lived in poverty and ignorance. Women had few rights, minorities were persecuted, and warfare was constant. The Crusades, the Inquisition, and the persecution of Jews and other minorities remind us that medieval ideals were often honored more in the breach than in the observance. But even these darker aspects of medieval life contributed to later developments. The violence and chaos of the early medieval period led to innovations in military technology and organization that would eventually make European armies the most effective in the world. The religious conflicts of the later medieval period contributed to the development of concepts of religious tolerance and individual conscience that would become central to modern democratic societies. The hierarchical nature of medieval society, while oppressive in many ways, also created stable social structures that could support long-term projects like cathedral building and university education. The very rigidity of the system created pressures for change that would eventually lead to more flexible and egalitarian forms of social organization. Medieval Europe also created the intellectual and cultural foundations for the great achievements of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. The humanist movement that began in the 14th century grew out of medieval scholasticism. The Protestant Reformation was made possible by medieval developments in theology and church organization. The scientific revolution built upon the logical methods and empirical observations of medieval scholars. The age of exploration that began in the 15th century was the culmination of medieval developments in navigation, shipbuilding, and commercial organization. The global empires that European powers would build in the early modern period were extensions of the trading networks and military technologies developed during the medieval centuries. Even the democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries had their roots in medieval concepts of limited government, individual rights, and popular participation in political life. The American Constitution drew heavily on medieval English precedents, and the French Revolution, for all its radical rhetoric, was in many ways the fulfillment of medieval ideals of equality and justice. As we look back over these 1,000 years of European history, we can see that the medieval period was not a time of stagnation or decline, but one of continuous development and innovation. Each generation built upon the achievements of its predecessors while adapting to new challenges and opportunities. The result was a civilization that was both deeply rooted in tradition and remarkably dynamic and creative. The medieval legacy is all around us today. Every time we attend a university, we participate in an institution created by medieval scholars. Every time we live under the rule of law, we benefit from legal concepts developed by medieval jurists. Every time we worship in a church, we enter a building whose architectural forms were perfected by medieval builders. More fundamentally, the values that we consider central to Western civilization, individual dignity, personal freedom, limited government, religious tolerance, and respect for learning, all have their roots in medieval developments. The modern world did not spring fully formed from the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, but grew gradually from seeds planted during the medieval centuries. This is why the medieval period deserves our attention and respect. It was not a dark age, but a formative age, not a time of decline, but a time of growth, not an ending, but a beginning. The people who lived through these centuries, the peasants and kings, the monks and merchants, the knights and scholars, were not primitive ancestors stumbling toward modernity, but creative human beings who faced their own challenges with courage, intelligence, and determination. Their achievements remind us that human progress is not inevitable, but requires constant effort and adaptation. Their failures remind us that even the greatest civilizations are fragile and must be constantly renewed. Their example shows us that ordinary people, working together with shared values and common purpose, can accomplish extraordinary things. As we face our own challenges in the 21st century, climate change, technological disruption, political polarization, and social inequality, we can learn from the medieval experience. Like our medieval predecessors, we must find ways to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving what is valuable from the past. We must build new institutions while maintaining social cohesion. We must embrace innovation while respecting tradition. The medieval Europeans who built cathedrals that took centuries to complete understood something that we sometimes forget, that the greatest human achievements require patience, persistence, and faith in the future. They built not just for themselves, but for generations yet unborn, trusting that their efforts would contribute to something larger and more enduring than their individual lives. This is perhaps the greatest lesson of the medieval period, that human civilization is not the work of any single generation, but the cumulative achievement of countless individuals working together across the centuries. We are the inheritors of their efforts, and we have the responsibility to pass on to future generations a world that is better than the one we received. The 1,000-year journey from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance was not just a chapter in European history, but a testament to the human capacity for growth, adaptation, and achievement. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can create light, and that from the ashes of one civilization, another can rise that is even greater than what came before. The medieval world is gone, but its legacy lives on in everything we are and everything we aspire to become. In understanding their story, we better understand our own, and in honoring their achievements, we find inspiration for our own efforts to build a better world for those who will come after us.